Woo! This session was fun. This week we had Elliot Dierkson. We went over Ubuntu. We went over Linux. We nerded out on Linux. So check us out. Here we go. And it's 6.
Do you understand?
There we go. Hey, Elliot. And you can start.
Oh, good morning, good afternoon. Anyway, I'm going to go through some basics on Ubuntu. I'm primarily going to be focusing on desktop, but some of this stuff also applies to Ubuntu server as well. Now, I am kind of an old school sort of person, so you know, some of this comes from an old school perspective. So anyway, but I'm going to start with a little bit of an intro here and some things that are interesting to me and hopefully interesting to you. I've had people tell me on more than a few occasions that I'm a cesspool of knowledge, so you're going to get a little bit of that. But anyway, here goes. So here are some of my first exposure to computers. That HP 9830A and the teletype, and then the 110 baud modem that dropped into an acoustic coupler. And if anybody cares, what that translates to is that's a little over 13 characters a second. So that's pretty slow. And that 9830A, what I remember about that was with the basic interpreter loaded, it had 3,808 bytes. Yes, bytes of memory free. So anyway, that was a long time ago. And this was my very first computer of my own. It was an Osborne 1. It was called a portable, but it's probably only portable if you consider a sewing machine to be portable. But that had 64K of RAM and two 320K floppy disk drives. So if you didn't already know, I'm older than Derek. So I've been in computers a long time. Started off mostly doing development, and then moved into like some sysadmin, some DBA stuff, some with Oracle, some with Informix. Worked with a lot of different flavors of Unix. So I've been around Unix stuff a long time, and I'm very comfortable with it, and it's definitely my favorite flavor of operating system. So
Why do you like Linux or Unix?
well, I mean, it's one of the first ones that I was exposed to, but I've just found that I've been able to do it, and it's stable. I mean, maybe I'm just biased, but it's rare to see a Unix or a Windows box that stays up longer than a month or two. And I've had Unix boxes at places that have 2-year uptimes. So
Let me tell you guys that someone told me this back in 1991, and in 1991 I was 18 years old, and I said, yeah, whatever. And they told me that Unix runs the world. And they said that, and this is a transition period. All the stuff that he's showing you, like the teletypes, what he was just showing you, is all the stuff I worked on in 1991. In fact, if you guys, it's a trivia question, but in It 6, the reason why I named this in It 6 is based on that was the first command that I've ever learned in my whole career. And it's almost like the first guys that do land administration, right? I went to a training class in 1991, and it was Intro to Unix. And I paid attention. I promise you I paid attention to class. It was so dry, I cried every day. And at the end of class, the guy says, if you learn anything, learn Init 6, okay? Init 6 is reboot. That's how you reboot on a Unix machine. And Init 6 has got me raises for the last 5 years after 91. So from 91 up to 96, and then 6 it made my career. So I always look back and laugh about that, right? Because because network engineers in the 90s, all we did was reset, reboot. But being serious, right? Your routers, all your network gear, everything's Linux. Everything has a Linux kernel in today. Even going to the Nexus boxes, right? The Nexus boxes, and everybody strive to have zero downtime. They utilize containers. So they utilize containers, which are just, little Unix kernels running, right? So everything revolves around Unix. So it may not be something that, well, if you're in security, if you're in cybersecurity, you better know Linux or Unix. But always, that's why these hobbyists, such as Elliot and myself, always go back to Linux and Unix because everything runs full circle. But sorry, I didn't mean to go ahead.
No, that's fine. I mean, so if you have an Android phone, that's based off of Linux. If you're a Mac person, Mac OS is kind of derived from a BSD Linux or BSD Unix kernel, excuse me. So yeah, it's everywhere, and it makes me think of a meme I saw somewhere with a kid standing next to the dad, and he goes, "Dad, what are clouds made of?" Well, Linux servers mostly. So. But and by the way, if at any point anybody's got any questions or anything like that, feel free to jump in. I'm happy to answer them. All right, so a little bit of history. So Unix goes way back. It was developed at Bell Labs. It was a stripped down version of an operating system called Multics. So somebody's joke about that was they called it Unix because it was Multics without balls. Anyway, AT&T no longer owns the copyright. Actually, I think the shards of Novell is who owns the actual copyright and source code to Unix now. But that's why you had so many different names for it, because the only person that was allowed to call it Unix was the person that held the copyright. HPUX, SunOS, Solaris, AIX, Xenix, and actually that was my first exposure to Unix was Xenix, and that was a port of Unix done by Microsoft. Now, you see very little of these things now, but there were versions, and then it got from version 7, and then it went to System 3, and I don't know what happened to System 4, but then it went to System 5, and then most of the things that you see that are based off of the original Unix source code are now System 5 Release 4. BSD was developed at Berkeley. I'm pretty sure they've removed most of the copyrighted parts of it, and they've redeveloped it. And then Linux was developed by, I know he's like Scandinavian, but anyway, so he rewrote a lot of stuff. So Linus Torvalds, and now there are a whole bunch of different distributions. One of the other things I'm going to try and talk about a little bit here is how you want to learn things. If you're not going to be a specialist on something, it's good to learn the things that are portable from one distribution to another. So, because you never know. I mean, talking about some of the Cisco collaboration appliances, a lot of those were Red Hat Enterprise Linux for a long time, and now they've switched to CentOS, so that they're a little different. But you're going to find yourself at various points having to deal with various different distributions. So it's a good thing to know a little bit about the different ones. And I promise this is not going to be slide heavy. I'm just kind of going through a few things. So here's one of my favorite interesting things, or at least it's interesting to me. So when you think of mechanical watches, what country do you think of?
Swiss.
Swiss.
Switzerland.
Switzerland, yeah.
Yeah. And when you think of digital watches, what country do you think of?
Japan.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to make it a question, but the truth of the matter is the digital watch actually got invented in Switzerland, but it was outside of their paradigm, or what they were used to, and this isn't what a watch is supposed to look like, so they didn't really do anything with it, and Japan was the one that really made it into a viable product. And that dovetails into the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. that was something they did, all kinds of amazing things there. Um, just those are just some of the things that I have there: laser printers, the first graphical operating system, the mouse, Ethernet, object-oriented programming. But Xerox didn't know what to make of it. One of my favorite things about that, and this is talked about in that PBS series, Triumph of the Nerds, but the guy who developed Ethernet, they let him leave with the patent, started a tiny little company you might have heard of called 3Com. Uh, Object-oriented programming was Wind River. They let all of these people leave with the patents for things. Steve Jobs took a tour of that, and he stole the idea of a graphical user interface from there. There were people that were working there that were like, you can't let this guy in here. He's going to take all of our ideas. And he took some of them, and then later on, Jobs was mad when Microsoft stole it from him, even though he stole it from PARC. So
Don't feel bad for Xerox. Please don't feel bad for Xerox. But go ahead.
Oh, and
I concur, since I worked there for about 6 years. I'm good.
No, but then the other funny thing is, actually in the late 80s, I actually saw a version 1.0 of Windows, which was just the most horrific thing that you'd ever want to see. And the one thing that I learned about that, sort of like Dierkson nitpicks there, was Alt space. That was how you got out of it.
Especially when it froze up, right? Or when you thought it was going to lock up before you got the blue screen of death, right?
Yeah, it was terrible. But anyway, so that's kind of the brief history part, and now we'll get into some more fun stuff. So we're going to be working today from my home lab, and this is my home lab. So some people have pictures of their kids all over the place. I have pictures of my lab in my rack. So,
and this is a caution. It's just the same caution that's on rated R movies, right? But this is a caution. Do not put this in your own home, okay? This right here is what we call electricity sipper. That's what it is. It doubles your electric bill. I promise you, it's the truth. I promise you.
He knows, because we had to pull a rack out of his house.
I had to tear down my data center because my wife said, "Look, I can either get a Mercedes or you can keep your or you can keep your lab." And I said, "Look, okay, all right, it's time for a car." That's how much electricity I was consuming with my rack. But go ahead, Elliot. I'm just jealous looking at this, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. If you notice there's a 240 outlet in there that I had to have put into my office. That's what drives the UPS on the bottom. So, all right. So now into the fun stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual machine with Ubuntu desktop. Now, this is a really key thing, because this one for a long time kind of frustrated me when I was first starting to build these, is you got to give it more memory on the video card than what ESXi gives it by default. If you don't, then you can't create any kind of resolution that's worth a darn, so it's almost unusable. So that's a really key thing. And now we are going to build ourselves an Ubuntu virtual machine. So I'm going to kick this off, and because some of these things take a little while to run, I have another Ubuntu desktop that's already built, and we're going to work from that to do some of the things that I want to talk about while we're watching this thing chunking and grinding. And again, feel free to ask if you got any questions, or why I do things in a particular way.
So while we're watching Elliot, why would you even need to build an Ubuntu station? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, right? I can tell you right now, I just did one this week, right? Ansible, right? To configure an Ansible server. Ansible, well, I just had to switch to Ubuntu because CentOS is no longer being, sorry for that. CentOS is no longer being distributed, I guess. So a use case, right? There's many times they come up in my career that I need an emergency solution. One of the times for example, this week, there was a virus that, sorry, my dogs are howling. There was a virus that took over a site, right? And in order to stop that virus, I had to make sure that um, clients did not keep going to certain websites. I did a 30-minute install of Ubuntu with a DNS server, putting all the clients towards that, and that's how it was eliminated the risk, right? The risk of them going out to the internet. So,
Yeah. All right. So here are a couple more things. As I'm building this, it would find the ISO file or the DVD drive anyway, but I'm going to say connect. Now what this does is this, when you're building it from scratch, also checks this little box that says connect at power on, because otherwise it'll come up and it'll act like it's trying to, search for something to do like a TFTP boot or something. We are going to come back later and make sure that we turn that off, because otherwise every time you power the machine on, it'll come up to the boot ISO. But in case I have to do something, whether it's a live file system or something like that, or do some repair, I pretty much always, if there's something connected to the DVD drive, I want it to boot from that. Normally there isn't going to be, but so I'm going to come over here to my VM options and tell it to force BIOS setup first time, or when it powers on the next time. So
another good reason to keep Linux, to use Linux, is you won't be able to use Cisco PyATS on Windows. So that's another reason to use Linux.
Yep, and FreeBSD is kind of my operating system of choice, but the PyATS isn't supported on that either. But there are a whole lot of reasons to use this. I mean, you can do RDP to things and stuff like that, but sometimes you'll just get people that they only want to give you access to certain stuff, and you can use this as like kind of a jump box or something. All right, so what I'm going to do here is, now that I'm in the BIOS options, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to make my CD-ROM the first boot choice. So we just have to remember at the end to turn off that connected at power on, and away we go here. So one of the things that's a little bit challenging about this during the install is when it's a virtual machine, we don't have OpenVM tools or anything like that in there, so it doesn't know quite what to make of the hardware. So there are going to be some times where our prompts aren't fully visible. So you sort of have to know where things are to be able to get it to do what you want, which is also a little challenging. And I'll show you what I mean here. Now, because I connected this one to a network that has internet connectivity and DHCP, and we can configure this for static addressing later, but out of the box it wants to do DHCP. It's giving me the option to go ahead and download some updates during the install process, which makes this move along faster. Now, I pointedly picked an older version of Ubuntu because we're going to do some updates and a release upgrade and stuff like that. So I want to make sure that we have the ability to do that. So if we start fresh, when we go to do an upgrade, it'll say, yeah, nothing's there.
So it sounds like Ubuntu desktop version particularly used for like a utility machine, right?
Oh yeah, it's a Swiss Army knife, and here is exactly what I'm talking about. You see how I can only see part of this? Well, just because I've been through this, and I admit I walked through this a few times, that's the back button. If I tab over one more time, that's the next. So it doesn't do this if you install it on real hardware, because it can see what it is, but right now it doesn't know what the heck it is. So it's just giving us the...
So VM tools is just not available for this version of Ubuntu?
It is, but it's not in the install image. That's one of the very first things that we're going to do here is we're going to put those VM tools on, because that'll allow us to get to a video resolution that's a whole lot more palatable.
Gotcha.
So, all right, so we're going to let this chunk and grind a little bit, and now we're going to move on here, and we're going to talk about some of the basics. Now, as you can see, Ubuntu desktop has a graphical operating system on it. Now, it's actually X Windows, and X Windows is sort of, it's almost like it's just sort of the display subsystem. What really makes it useful is a window manager. In this case, Ubuntu desktop has the Gnome window manager. There are a whole bunch of other window managers that can make the graphical experience look very different. I tend to like to stay with the lowest common denominator on stuff, because I'm something of a generalist and I find myself moving around quite a lot. So learning things that are particularly unique to one window manager or one distribution haven't been all that useful to me. So, but here's some of the things we're going to work with in our other VM while we're waiting for this other one to install. Again, don't be afraid of the command line. I like the command line. I also remember an old joke where somebody once said, people say Unix isn't user-friendly. That's not true. It's just very particular about what users it wants to get friendly with. So we're going to give you an intro here, so hopefully you can be a little bit comfortable with it. So navigating around, CD or change directory is pretty much the same as if you're talking about command prompt on anything else. One of the big commands that you're going to want to know is ls, and that is the equivalent of directory in command prompt on Windows. Whenever you're running the command line, it's running some sort of shell, and there are a whole bunch of different shells. That's another one where I tend to want to stay with the lowest common denominator too, because if you get particularly used to one shell and then you get over to some other distribution and they're not there, well, then you're kind of stuck. So there's Bourne shell, which is one of the very first ones, and then C shell. The thing that you'll see most often on your Linux distributions is Bash, which is short for Born Again shell. So that's mostly what we're going to stay with here. I'm going to do a few things at the command line here where literally we're writing a small program on the fly. We could put these into a text file, make it executable, but you can also just sit there and type it on the fly. IO redirection, that's where you either say, okay, instead of me typing stuff, I want to send you the input from a particular file, or I want to send my output somewhere else. And then there's also your error messages. On any Unix system, there are 3 standard files open that represent your I/O. 0 is standard input, or stdin. Number 1 is standard out, std out, which is your normal command output, and then standard error, which is number 2. So you could redirect your output of a command, but if it just says, okay, I'm putting this to standard error, then you'll still see the message. There are a number of editors on there, but the one that almost always you're going to be able to find on a Linux distribution or almost any Unix system is VI. Now, it's a modal editor. It's a text editor. It's not a word processor, but don't be scared. It's not that bad. You probably don't need to know all that much just to do some basics in it, but it's a really good thing to know if you're somewhere and for whatever reason you need to be able to navigate around or look at some files and maybe make some changes. And as the snotty old Unix guy, we're going to talk about a little bit about the file structure, and in this case, the slashes go in the right direction. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that, and then we're going to back up to this slide, and I'm actually going to work around on a few things in the command line. So if you think about a system with one optical drive connected, over here on the Windows side, you know, the computer is kind of the root. Your hard disk is C, and when you've got something on the optical, that's going to be D. Everything on a Unix or Linux system is going to start from the root, and then you mount other file systems at various points along there. So same stuff. By default, a lot of times the mount points for this are going to be in /media. So with that CD-ROM mounted, this is what the file system would look like on a Linux box as compared to on a Unix box. And, you know, all the slashes there. All right, so we're going to come back here, and we're actually going to do some stuff, and I'm going to leave this one running. Actually, we're at a perfect point here, and I'll show you what I mean about disconnecting the CD, because he's going to come up here in a moment and ask me to remove the CD. Although this is a funny one, it issues an eject command so that it actually unmounts the ISO, but it's going to tell you, hey, you have to remove the CD, which is sort of silly, but it is what it is. All right, so we're going to look at our other VM over here while it's doing that. Still see our Firefox up from our trip through NSO last week. So one of the nice things about Bash, and you kind of can't see it in there, is it's got that tilde. So it's actually telling you, very much like a Windows command prompt, where you are. So right now I'm in my home directory. So if I wanted to go to, in Unix speak, this would be called temp, but it's /tmp. Any file system that you have, when someone says temp, they generally mean tmp. See how my prompt changed? And let's see what kind of files we've got in here. Now they're just temp files. I find this to be hard to see, so by default, a lot of Linux things will alias ls to do stuff that I don't really want it to do. So I'm going to get rid of that alias. I suppose it would help if I told it what I want to unalias. So now when I do an ls, everything is just monochrome. Various options to things, like I'm going to tell this, okay, -F tells me show a slash after things that are directories. Now, do I have any files in here? Yes, I have a couple files. So touch is a command that just creates a blank file. Now let me talk a little bit about VI. So what I mean by a modal editor is you're either in edit mode or you're in command mode. So colon brings me down here. This is how I know I'm in command mode. I'm going to say quit. That takes me out. So say either I, you can do I to insert or A to append. Capital I will take you to the first character of a line. Capital A will take you to the end of a line. Generally speaking, you don't need to get too tricky in this, but you at least need to know enough to get around. There's some neat things that you can do from the command line. Escape gets you back to command mode. So I'm going to do this where I'm going to move line 2 to the end of the file. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. You can do global search and replaces. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to look for a line that has sample on it. And when I find a line that has sample on it, I'm going to change file to text file, and I'm going to do that globally. Well, maybe I'm not. All right, there we go. So they are kind of complicated, but don't let that frighten you too much. All you really need to know is you've got your arrow commands where you could, or your arrows where you can move around. You can use X to delete characters, and :W writes it, and :Q will get you out of it. There are all kinds of references on that. There's a version called Vim. I forget what that's short for, but it's a little easier than VI. But
It's
if you really want,
enhanced, I think.
yeah. But if you really want to be prepared for almost anything, you better know something about VI to be able to get around and at least look at stuff. It does have more, so there's not a whole lot in here, but actually, so we're going to look at the password file here, and it'll do that a screen at a time. So more is similar to the more on command prompt, but in Windows, but you can give it an argument. Let's see what else. Oh, so I'm going to do something where I know that it's going to generate some standard error. So we're going to talk a little bit about the IO redirection here. So almost any command on Unix these days, if you do a ---- help or a -?, it'll give you some help information on how to use the command. Well, let's say I want to help, or I want to save that. So at >, I'm going to redirect that into ls.help. So now, and I could have piped that more. I'm going to get more into piping and stringing things along here later. But you can see that that generated an awful lot of stuff. Now, actually trying to look for, there we go. So this is going to be something that goes to standard error. So I'm going to redirect my standard output to, I got an extra greater than in there, into ls.foo. But because I gave it something that was invalid, I still saw that output. So this is where we're talking about those file numbers. So I can say I want my 2, which is standard error, into ls.error. Now I didn't get any output, and cat is sort of the same as type. So here's ls.error. So that got redirected there. And you can get really cute with this, where I want that to go into that one. So if I redirect standard error before I redirect standard out, they can all go into one place. So I'm going to say 2 into &1. I mean to do that in a different shell, because that's more of a Bourne shell thing. All right, well, it doesn't want to play nice with me today, so get back out of my Bourne shell. Let's go back and let's check on our install here. That's not being very cooperative. I went through this like, I'm not even sure how many times today, and it all went along fine. Now that I want to do this live, it's not cooperating with me. Okay.
So what is the purpose of creating this standard error file?
Well, standard error is going to be where it's going to send you error messages. Like if you give it something like an invalid option or something odd happens with a command. So you might want to redirect your standard output someplace to save the output of a command. But if it generates an error, you still want to see that unless you redirect it somewhere else.
Okay, so it's like a long file.
Sort of. I mean, it's just your regular output goes one place and your error messages go somewhere else.
Okay.
I think there's a real value to those if you're writing scripts, but I wouldn't want to say
Yes.
more because you probably have those ahead. But it's
Yeah.
like an error log when you have scripts, so you will see the value there.
Yes. So
I
you
got you.
see. So this is actually like 2 versions back of Ubuntu, and this is the version of Gnome with that. Well, we're not going to be buying anything today, so we're going to unlock that from the launcher. So now we've got space, and we're going to find our friend, the command line here, and that is the terminal application. There's also Xterm. That's something a little bit different, but we're mainly going to stay with the terminal. And we're going to lock him in here because we always want to be able to find him quickly. So one of the other good things, and why I'm staying with terminal, even though I'm not a Mac person, they call it terminal on a Mac too. So stay with the thing that has the broadest scope. So now we're going to back here, and we're going to talk about some of these things. So think of run as administrator on a Windows box. That's what sudo is. Now there is actually a user called root, and that is the same rough thing as administrator, but you don't let people log in as root because it's that's going to be a shared credential. It creates nightmares for logs, so we're going to use sudo to do that. On Ubuntu, apt mostly. There's some weird subcommands with apt get and apt cache and stuff like that. I'm going to stick mainly with apt because apt does all of that. Now, one of the things that has changed that is really nice as you move from one platform to another is, even though some things use different package managers, like some of the other Linux distributions use Yum, FreeBSD uses PKG to handle packages, almost all of these things will take the same basic arguments. Now we're going to use our test machine here, and we're going to watch it chunk and grind in a minute, and we're going to upgrade the software on this one, and we're going to do that from the command line. We're also going to do some of the basic updates, but we're going to do some of those from the GUI as well. And we're also going to get into some of the configuration files here. And if you don't ever really want to say etc, it's another snotty Unix person kind of thing, but that's called etc, or user local etc. Actually, that's another one, /usr, that's referred to as /user, even though it isn't spelled user. I can't tell you why, but it's kind of been that way forever. So those are things that you'll run into that, like, /tmp is in temp, things that don't completely make sense. So we're going to come over here. Now we're going to do our first round of updates on this one. We're going to do that from the GUI. So we're going to say software. We're going to kick off software updater here. He's going to go out and say, hey, look at this. We've got some updated software to install. Now it's going to go out, grab a list, and it's going to come back. Now, if you're the user that you install as part of the system has the ability to use sudo or do privilege escalations. If you create another user account, it doesn't have that permission unless you explicitly authorize it to do that. So it's asking me for my password again to make sure that I'm really allowed to do that stuff. We'll let the details sit there and run while we do some of these other things. Now, strictly speaking, this is kind of bad form, but since I'm going to be running multiple commands, I'm going to do it. The purest way to do these things would be every command that I want to run as administrator, I should say sudo that command, but I'm going to be a little bit lazy here. and I'm just going to run bash. And because this is a different instance and it hasn't prompted me for my password yet, it's going to ask me for that. Now you can see I've got this pound there. That pound is going to tell me that, all right, you're running as root privileges now. So ID is something else. It says I'm root, my group ID is root, and these are the groups I'm in. If you want to see what permissions you have, I got out of that one. I'm in the sudo group on this one, and that's what gives me the ability to run these sudo commands. On some other distributions, you may find that there's a group called wheel, and that will be where some of those things are. So I'm going to go back into bash, and because it had just prompted me for my password, it knows, oh, okay, I've already authenticated you, so I don't need to ask you again. So what I'm going to do on this system is, first, I'm going to update my list of software here. Make sure that I have all the most recent updates for what the versions of all the packages are. So it went out and grabbed that, and it's telling me I can list what's upgradable. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's just upgrade this guy. Actually, I got a little carried away. It's going to say, wait for it to say yes, but I double tapped the keyboard there. So he's going on here and he's upgrading the commands on this instance. So this will only take a couple of seconds here, or it should only take a couple of seconds. And then poof, we'll have done our updates. I don't know if I'm going too fast or too slow. Does anybody have any questions so far?
So these updates, they are just a standard part of initial installation, right?
Well, I mean, it's also ongoing. Like, you know, Microsoft has Patch Tuesday. Anytime that there are, you know, either updates for features or updates for security, think of it very much as the same thing as Windows Update. So, I mean, at this point, anything that's software, people are going to find security holes to it and stuff like that. So there are always going to be some updates.
Okay.
Now, one of the other things that APT can do for us here is it can show us what we've got installed. Now this is, actually I forgot the extra minus there. Now this is going to be a whole ton of things. So these are all the packages that I've got installed. Now I didn't ask for all of these, but a lot of times when you go to install something, you'll find that it has a dependency of some sort. And one of the nice things about these package managers is that they will automatically install dependencies for you. If you say, hey, I want Python, or you know, I want the LXML Python library, and you don't have Python on there, it'll say, oh, well, to have that Python library, you need Python. So it'll go ahead and install those things. Well, as you get updates, those updates, some of those dependencies may change. So one of the nice things that this will do for you is I can say apt auto remove. Actually, in this case, this one doesn't have any dependencies there. But if there were dependencies that had been there that are now orphaned, well, it'll get rid of them. All right, and we're ready to restart after our software update there on this box. And we're going to do our release update on this one from the command line. So I'm going to tell him to ask me later. Actually, while he's doing that, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to change. Actually, it helps if I hit the right option there. I'm going to come over here to this DVD drive. Now you see I had him connected during the install. He ejected that drive, but it's still set to be connected at power on, which I don't want. If I shut this guy down and I have that installed, I don't want him to boot off the CD. So I'm going to change that. Boom, we're good there. Why did he not reboot? This is crazy. I went through this like 5 times this morning, and now that I go to do this live, it's being uncooperative.
Trust me, that's what happens.
Yeah, isn't it always the way? So actually, one of the things that I forgot to do here, and now we're back to asking me if I want to do an upgrade, is I'm still at a really low resolution here. So I'm going to use some of these things to put the VMware tools on here. So I'm again going to be a bad guy, and I'm just going to go straight to bash. And I know that I need to find the VM tools, but I can't remember exactly what the package name is for it. So I'm going to use our friend apt to search for open-vm. I know it's something like that. And hey, there we go. We've got a couple of things. Now you notice there are a couple of differences. Here's the difference. The one that says desktop includes some of these X Windows components and display drivers and things like that. If you are running Ubuntu server without X Windows installed, you just install this OpenVM tools. But I happen to know that, you know, and we can see it right here, that we've got graphical interface. So I want this one. Now, this is one of my favorite little time saver things. Now, I clip this like anything else. If I right click that, I can copy, and then I can right click and paste. But here's part of my favorite thing, because I'm a terrible typist. So anything that helps me go faster is something that I like a lot. So I just highlighted that. Shift insert will just paste whatever I just had there. So I'm going to say apt install shift insert, boom, there we go. And here's what I'm talking about with these dependencies. It's saying these ones are going to be uninstalled. These dependencies are going to be installed because the OpenVM tools needs that. Do you want to do that? And I'm going to say yes. All right, so now we can bring this guy up, and we can change his resolution just by resizing this VMware. What? Yeah. Well, he doesn't want to cooperate with me today either. Goodness. I swear I did all this earlier. Well, we're going to feel our way through this then. So we're going to come into our display, and this is something that because he can't actually see the hardware, he's saying, oh, this is an unknown display. I'm just going to go up to 1024 by 768, and I happen to know that this is the apply button there, and boom, there we go. Now look, we've got a much more usable resolution on this one. So I'll go back to all settings here, and we're going to close that one out for now. So I'm going to let this guy go through an upgrade from the command line, and we're going to work through some of these other things on our other VM. I just cannot type with a darn today. We're going to get him kicked off and going, and then we're going to move back to our other machine here. So it's interesting, we're on version 16. So this in version 16 is kind of like our start version. Now, this virtual machine over here is actually on version 20. So for him, it's over there. So that obviously there are differences in the user interface from one version to the next. And that's just sort of something that you got to get used to. All right, so he's starting. I want to talk about some of the system files here. Now we're going to go to etc. So Remember, we were talking about groups and user accounts and things like that. Well, those particular files live in etc. So here's our group file. Actually, that had a little more in it than I was expecting, so I'm going to use more on that. Now you notice in here, there's that sudo group. That's what gives my account the ability to run sudo commands to get privilege escalation. If I took that out of there, I wouldn't be able to do it. Now there are actually some nice things in the user interface that allow you, when you create a user, to say, should this user have the ability to do sudo commands, and it's pretty easy. If you're doing this on a Ubuntu server, it may not have a graphical user interface installed on it. So how do we deal with that? Well, I'm going to edit this file. I'm not actually going to save the changes. So I'm going to pull up group here, and I happen to know I'm in command mode now, so I can look for something. So slash drops me down here to search, and there we go. I said I'm looking for sudo. So say, just for purposes of example, so I'm going to use a capital A. So that's going to put me into append mode at the end of the line, and I'm going to say comma Derek, and I'm going to add Derek's user account, so Derek will be able to do sudo commands on this one.
Derek
Gets me out of that.
Derek would never do sudo. Derek will always do he will always do sudo. I don't know why. There's two groups: the sudo and the sudo people. So I do.
I'm a pseudo guy, Derek.
Welcome to
He's
Team
saying
Pseudo.
SU do. I'm like, when did we start calling it SU do?
Linux fight. Linux fight.
All right. So I'm not going to save these files. So I'm going to say quit, but he's going to come up and say, hey, you changed this file. Are you sure you want to do that? So another one of those Unix speak things, an exclamation point, is frequently referred to as a bang. So I'm going to do a Q bang, saying, yes, I know I changed things, but I just want to quit, and I don't want to save these. So a couple of your other really key
you added
files.
the bang.
Yeah, so Q bang, and I just quit and discarded any changes that I had. So here's another one of these with like kind of a weird truncation of something. So this is what's referred to as the password file, but it's actually passwd. This is where our user accounts are defined. And you can see, so we've got, almost all of these have the same ones, but you've got a user ID and then a group ID. Now, in the password file, way back when computing power was a lot less expensive, or was a lot more expensive, they actually used to put the encrypted password in the password file, and this file is world readable. So when I give -L option to that, it tells me all these things. So there are 3 groups in everything when you look at the permissions on a file. You've got owner, group, and then other. So this is saying password is readable and writable by the owner, and it's readable by the same group, and it's in group root, and it's readable by public, which is the last one. Now, because just brute force works so much better than it did way back when, the encrypted password has actually been moved to a file called shadow. And you can see shadow is readable and writable by the owner. It's readable by group shadow, but it's not readable by everybody else. So we can look at shadow because we're in his root right now. That's interesting. I guess they've moved that. Well, so if you want to edit these things, and this is be really careful, because you can lock yourself out and really mess things up badly. But see, the command I'm using there is vipw. that will create a temporary file that puts all of these variables into one place. Except it still doesn't have the password in there. All right, well, that's what I get for freelancing on this, because it's like this on other things. Well, actually, I'm going to show you someplace else. So this is a FreeBSD system. That has, all right, never mind. I'm going to stop freelancing today because it's just not working for me. So they're the base system things. They're in etc. But when you add packages, a lot of times they will put things into user local etc. That's where things are going to be. Now you remember Derek talking about, or my run state things, talking about init6. Well, Unix has a concept of run levels. So you see these RCs. I think that was short for run control. To be honest, I don't actually remember. But these different run levels, it's sort of like, are you in single user mode? Are you in multi-user mode? So RC0 is shutdown. RC1 would be single user mode. RC2 is typically the multi-user mode. And this doesn't really happen very much anymore. But on some systems, if you had NFS or network file system shares, those wouldn't start until you hit run level 3. So in each of these directories, so we're going to go in there, and these are the commands that start up these things. Now, see how they all have names and numbers? So anything that's an S, that means it's a startup. Now, you might not want this one here, so let's say the GDM3, to start before something that's named differently. That's why you've got the number, because it leafs through these files during boot up, and it's going to run them with an argument that says either start or stop. And that's how you control smooth startup and shutdown of services. One other thing that is really nice that has become much more standardized even across FreeBSD and different Linux distributions is a lot of these will have a command called service. So I'm going to temporarily stop the SSH service. So it's going to tell me it's not running right now. So I did status. Well, now I want to bring it back up. So say, for example, I had wanted to change something in some of my SSH options. So here are our keys. Now, like SSHD config, that controls some things like your the different encryption methods you use. Say I changed some of these. Actually, your useless fact for the day, the backup utility for some of the Cisco collaboration appliances only uses some of the lighter weight ciphers or encryption methods because they're trying to move through in speed. Well, they're not included by default in SSH. So since I use this virtual machine sometimes as a backup target, you can say like ciphers and give it an explicit list, or the nice thing is whatever the defaults are, you can have these things where you say, okay, then these are key exchange algorithms with a plus there. I'm just adding those. It's also, I don't know if it's just a Unix convention, but that pound at the front of that means that's a comment. So some of the older versions of the collaboration appliances use the blowfish encryption method, which is a public domain one. And by the way, that's what's on my shirt here is a blowfish. Seemed appropriate for the day. But that might be why I would want to start and stop SSH. I went over here and changed one of my config files, and I want to restart that service to, make it take the new options that I put in the config file. Also got all of my public keys and stuff like that. Well, getting ready to get into things where we're going to be doing some more pipelining and stringing some commands together and stuff like that. So anybody got any questions at this point?
I have one. So in the Etsy, can you create your own groups?
Yes,
You
absolutely.
can. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that you would typically do, but here's a perfect use for that. So we're going to go to /home, and that's normally where your user accounts would be. Well, let's say I want to have a directory that's writable by everybody in our study group. And right now, I'm going to pretend Derek's on the system and say Derek and I are in different groups. Well, here's how I would do that. So I'm going to go back to Etsy, and I'm going to edit my group file. And I'm pretty sure that there are some utilities to do this in, like the settings part of Ubuntu, but I'm not going to use them, partly because I'm just a, grumpy old Unix guy, and partly because this is something that's portable on almost any Unix derivative you're going to run into. There, group and password are going to be there. So if you know how these things work, then you're good to go. So do some more interesting VI stuff. So you can yank and put things, which is kind of like copy and paste. So I did you can't see it, but I did a YY, which yanks the current line. And I'm going to paste that. And CW, which is a change word. And I'm going to create a group called study group. And an R is going to replace a single character. And in the group called study group, I'm going to put Elliot and Derek. Now I'm going to go back to home, and I'm going to make a directory called study group. Now, since I'm root, by default, if you give ls a directory, it's going to list the contents of the directory by default. So I'm going to give ls the D option. And I'm going to do my little cut and paste and shift insert thing again. And you can see that that's owned by root and root. Well, I want this to be owned by study group. So I'm going to say change group study group. So that's the group. And then study group also happens to be the name of the target. So now if we look at that one again, you can see now it's owned by study group. Well, that's good, except we've got just read and execute on there. We don't have the ability to write, so nobody else would be able to save any files. So there's a command called change mod, and this is what you use to change permissions on this. Now you can give things explicit permissions, and they're 3 numbers. It's actually so the low order bits are so 4 is read, 2 is write, and 1 is execute. But you can also do relative things. So what I want to do here is I want to make the group able to write this. So I'm going to say group plus write study group. Now I look at this, and you can see there's a W in that one. So anybody that was in the group study group would be able to do that. Now, it may not show me this yet because I have not logged out and logged back in. Yeah, it doesn't show my group there. So if you change somebody's group membership, and Control D is exit from a shell, by the way. Did want to close the tabs there. So I'm going to log out. Get our update moving along there. So now I'm logged back in. as soon as he gives me back my screen here. Now when I do that ID, why did he not add that? Well, maybe you have to do that somewhere else. Or, I don't know, do I have to, I bet I have to reboot for that one. Well, my virtual servers are pretty quick, so we're just gonna go ahead and reboot him. Again, that's what
Can
I
I
get
ask
for freelancing.
something while you're rebooting?
Absolutely.
Right, so we'll move too far. I'd like to say about the VI part and Vim. I've been using VI into checkpoint firewalls. There's no Vim there, so you often find yourself in situations like that. Have VI on board, but not Vim. It's a larger packet. So about the question, I've come across a few times issues where I have to create another user for Linux servers, Ubuntu most of the time. So I'm meeting those commands, user add, user stuff like that. I know there are the files for that. So the question is, are you supposed to use the user add or user commands, or can you get an equivalent of that with the files? Because I know you can automate stuff with scripts, even for commands that are more complex, but editing files is very easy with Ansible or even Fast tools. So can you automatically create users and groups like that?
Yeah,
there's sort of what you're demoing, right? Or do you have to put more stuff in, like where the home directories or?
You got that? Okay.
Yeah. So there are. Oh, actually, that's because I'm. Not here. Yeah, there are user add utilities, and that's probably safer because I was silly and I didn't look at where it creates all of those shadow things and stuff like that. So it does still work that way on some Unix derivatives. Yes, you're probably safer to go ahead and do that stuff if there are utilities like user add and group add and things like that, because I think that will also signal the system to go ahead and reread those files. That's why I had to reboot. As you can see now, I am a member of the study group now, so I can go to /home /study group. Oh, another very nice thing with Bash is it has completion. So I'm pretty close. I just hit tab and it completes that. That works with files. That works with, changing directories and stuff. So if you're a crummy typist like me, that's a very good thing.
So you're saying that this process, what you just did, can be automated?
Well, yeah, depending on what you want to do. You can use user ads. This is kind of a Swiss Army knife, and I know this isn't the best, just like Derek was talking about when we first started today, where all these things make the most sense is when you have a use case for something where that actually, does something for you other than, hey, this is, this is a great tool that makes, mounds and mounds of julienne fries, but if you don't like French fries, well, that's nice. That doesn't do me any darn good. So,
can I comment? So,
oh yeah.
So just for that particular, so automation in these user files, you can just get away with just editing these files instead of using the tools, right? So, to give you, it's the big picture, right? So I normally don't really deal with Ubuntu desktop that often, right? Because I like the CLI, I like the command line. So if I download a flavor of in my lab, right, it's normally a command line utility, right? But I have seen, and I'm going to start this off saying the most powerful tool you can have in your tool bag is Linux. Okay. I've been in countries that again, I'll go back to Dominican Republic. We got a customer in Dominican Republic. This customer wanted to be fully open source. So all they used for the receptionist all the way to engineers was Ubuntu. Everybody had to use Ubuntu, right? For automation, it wasn't really anything that advanced. All they did was edit the groups and users and everything else using simple, FTP, right? Pulling files, editing files, and this is just automating groups to pull from a central repository those files. Ubuntu is incredibly powerful utility. Everything you want to do, and I'm not saying Ubuntu, but just Linux. Anything you want to do, anything that's already created, it's already in this box. If you wanted to virtualize servers, boxes, everything else, Linux is a hypervisor. Linux has KVM, which actually does the same thing that VMware does, right? If you wanted to have a DNS server, you have one. I promise you, it takes me 5 minutes to go ahead and configure DNS to have, a DNS server, a Linux DNS server. If you wanted to have NTP, if you wanted to have anything, if you wanted to have a domain controller, right? Linux can do everything. It's powerful. You can run a whole network off of Ubuntu or Linux, right? Why people don't? Those are the last 20 years. There's questions that I don't even know. But like I said, people have always told me early in my career, everything comes around, right? And this is when they were talking about Unix. Everything's going to come around again, right? It never really went away. It never went away. Every Cisco router, every Cisco switch, every Arista switch, every vendor runs Linux. Juniper, every vendor runs a Linux kernel. So it's not going to go away. But that's why it's so powerful to know this. And you'll know with like every time I go to Cisco Live, other than Elliot, there's a bunch of old school people that nerd out and we giggle like little school kids, right? You say in at 6, we just because it's been around for so long and we know how powerful it is. It's an amazing tool. Development. You guys want to be developers. I can promise you, if you're running scripts in a customer network, if you're automating, number one, it's going through some form of Linux, right? Ansible runs on top of Linux, right? So you're going to see Linux in your career a lot.
Well, so let me reference something talking about what you were doing this morning, Derek, where you were running some Ansible or some Python scripts to do something. Say you've got a customer environment and they don't, they're like a pure Windows shop, and you've got something like this where you need to run some Ansible or you need to run some Python, and they don't want to put open source on there. You can say, all right, well, build me a virtual machine with Ubuntu on it, and I can use this as a launching pad for a lot of these things. So, well, now we're really going to get into some of the fun stuff here. So I just have one last goofy slide here. Surf the pipeline. So pipeline means piping commands together or stringing them together to do something. So this is where this is programming in Linux, and you can do all kinds of things with that. So let me tell you exactly what I mean there. So now here, I was just using a command. All right, so everything in Unix has some sort, because you remember I put that teletype up there on one of the first slides. A lot of starting off, Unix systems when this was developed were teletypes. So these things are slow and noisy and paper's expensive. So everything gets abbreviated. This is a great command, grep. Now, what the heck does grep mean? I'll tell you what grep means. Grep means global regular expression print. And no, I'm not actually kidding. So a regular expression, that's something else, and that could be a whole nother topic all unto itself. So I'm doing a very simple command, or stringing two commands together here. So I did an apt list -- installed, which is telling me, okay, show me all the packages that are installed here. well, I've got to go through and run a Python script to go put a bunch of machines into an isolation VLAN, and I don't want to try and do it manually. I'm going to do it with Python, but I want to find out, hey, do I have Python available here? So I'm going to take my output from apt list, and I'm going to pipe this to grep Python. Well, great news. I already have Python here, so we're good to go. I don't need to install anything. But that is just the beginning of things that you can do. So I'm going to go back to temp. Let's see what we've got here. Yes, I do have some files. Okay, so I'm going to do a for loop. And you can do this kind of stuff on the fly and do all kinds of interesting things with it. So I'm going to say for name, and that's a variable name in star. So star is going to get everything in this directory. So I get the greater than, which tells me I'm continuing a command. So I'm going to say do, so that's what opens my loop. And now I'm going to get into some even more interesting things. So I'm going to say if test minus F, so test is a command, and it just returns a status code. And 0 is true, anything other than 0 is false. So if I say test minus F $name, then echo $name is a file. So here's another little funny thing. When you close a lot of things, you do it in reverse. So to end an if statement, it's phi, and then I end my do with a done. And it sat there and it ran through all of those things. So we can do another example of this one here, and we can get even crazier with this stuff. So I'm going to say we're going to do for name in star again. And I'm going to say case. Now, I'm going to use a construct here, and I'll show you where this has some value. I just kind of do this to remind myself of what thing is. I'm going to use some squiggly braces here. Case $name. I haven't actually had to do this in a while, so that's right. So I'm going to say star VMware star. Yeah, maybe I won't do case statements today. But anyway, when you get to the end of a case, it's an ESAC. So that's how you end something. Let me see if I can something here where I can illustrate some of these things. I'm going to jump over to my FreeBSD box, and I'm going to go look at some of these scripts that I have here. It's supposed to be a more. All right. So here's an interesting script. So what I was doing here is I was looking for files that are duplicated, and I want to run a checksum on them. So let's look at this file. All right, so see all these files have an X on them? That means that you can execute them. Well, that could be a binary file. It could also be some kind of text, or it could be some command file. So how does it know what to do with this file if it's not actually a binary? Well, that pound bang, that tells it, oh, when you execute this file, you need to invoke a Bourne shell. And I'm going to set up some variables. I'm going to run a find command. I'm going to pipe that to a line and do a bunch of other things. So I'm doing a read. So I'm reading variables. So there's all kinds of stuff that you can do here. So anyway, I kind of intended to get more into some of these things. Oh, I'm going to show you one last thing. So this is just sort of a convention for me, as I put the variable names into inside of squiggly brackets. Well, there's a reason for that.
Hey, Elliot, we're kind of running long, but keep in mind that we can do a shell scripting class.
Okay.
Right. So keep that in mind.
Okay. Well, I'll show you this last thing, and then I'll quit. So I'm going to call, var equals I there. So this is text. Actually, it would help if I use the right characters, huh? And so that's only going to exist in this process unless I export it. So now it'll get inherited by other things. If I say echo $my var, there's the contents. But if I say echo my var1, there's nothing, because it thinks the variable name is my var1. But I can put these all together inside of the text, and it has my variable and then the text after it. So yeah, you're probably right, Derek. We should probably leave shell programming for another thing, because I probably want to get into some shell and some awk and some sed and things like that.
Because what he showed you, I mean, this right here is actually very valuable information, right? But I think it'd be better, right, if we had one dedicated to shell, because now that I think of it, it's probably the best introduction to development and programming that at least that's the way I started, right? So.
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to tie everybody up too long. I mean, I can go on and on and on this stuff because I love Unix. But anybody got, any questions on any of this stuff here before we wind this up?
I just want to comment. I've put a couple of links. Ignore the middle one on the chat. Inga, I think, asked, can you automate stuff? Besides the obvious response that you can automate it with scripts that are Unix scripts, and Elliot has just shown us a couple of stuff there and promised to do more by Derek's invite. So the first link is a small article where it shows how one can use Ansible to do that, meaning there's a guy there who is using this to prepare the laptops for his family. So the very first steps he does is create users and stuff like that. So you can take a look at that. And also about adding users, I think you can use the link there, the third link, to see the differences with add user, because user add is the option for the command where you have to explicitly tell it whatever you want it to do. But they've created a more polite version, let's say, which does some stuff automatically for you, like create a home directory and stuff like that. So that's all about it.
Okay. Yeah, that's all good. Yeah, and that's the thing is there are variants in user add and add user and things like that depending on the distributions. Some of those are I said they're specific to the distributions. But the one thing that is good is when you learn how those things work from the actual files, that stuff is pretty portable from almost any version of Unix anywhere. So
that's why I asked in the first place, if you can do this only with files.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
And I just commented that there is the more polite version of add user, which does stuff automatically, and Elliot commented that it's better if you learn the basic how things basically work, because you can port it anywhere. And I said that that's why I initially asked if we can do all the changes for the users from the files themselves.
Oh, exactly. So I you guys have brought up a pretty good point. That's the argument between user add and add user. But the reason why that's important is, did you show people on here, if they didn't know what a command does, how to find out?
Well, no, I did not. So there are several ways to do that. One of them is with the -- help, but there's another thing which is called the manual page for something. So say I want to figure out what my options are for ls, I can say man space ls, and that'll bring up a man page. Now this does not every, if you get something like an appliance, it may not always install the man pages, but this can even be things for like files, like I'm going to say man group. Now, that's another topic for another day, but you see that section number in there. So 5 is files. So if I say man password, it's probably first going to pick section 1, which is the password command. But then if I say man 5 password, then that's going to give me the information on the password file. So there's sections to man pages. A lot of times you're not going to run into overlap, so it doesn't actually matter if you know the group, the man group for where those things are. But man is your friend, and -- help is your friend, or in some cases -? It will also generate the help.
So Unix is fully documented. Let me take a step back. So for most of you people, so what happens is, I've been using Unix, Linux since 1991, but it wasn't until 3 years ago. I don't know, Rich, I'm getting old. 3 years ago that I decided to take the hardest test of my life, which was the Red Hat engineering certification, right? And I can tell you that I learned things I thought I knew, right? And that's to be is harder than CCIE. I promise you, that exam was harder than the CCIE. It's, if you guys want to learn more about this, I'm telling you, it's a great addition to your tool belt. I can actually schedule stuff. It's going through documentation and finding what you want to do is basically why the exam is so great, because you have access to your own node, right? And you're going through, and you don't have the web. You just have, a Linux box that has documentation that you need to find to figure out how to do things, right? So we can work through that one day as well. I can promise you that I will probably even teach Elliot new things and going through it, because this exam, I promise you, was a very tough exam, very tough exam. But any questions in regards to Linux? Any suggestions, or any maybe you want to expand on something that we can schedule in another week? Anything like that? I would be happy to do that. Until you look at this, it's very difficult for me to swallow how much information. But I'm telling you right now, there's a lot of
file management, Derek. File management as well. It's a difficult topic, like file masks and stuff like that. That's very difficult.
But I love it. I love geeking out with it. I mean, I promise you, things that I've done with Linux. I've created firewalls out of Linux, from Linux. I've created routers, right? Company didn't have any money, created routers with Linux, right? So it's a Swiss Army knife. Can do anything you want. Load balance, does whatever, right? So it's a very powerful tool. It's overlooked, but see what you guys don't see behind the scene. Open source is making a move on the market. Open source is making a move in the market. Red Hat is probably, well, they're owned now by IBM, but Red Hat is probably the biggest influencer in the market today when it comes to all these new technologies that are coming out, right? Docker, right? I'm not saying that but Red Hat grabs these open source tools and they go ahead and enhance them, right? So Linux is not going away; it's here to stay. So add that to your toolbox.
Don't forget Cumulus Linux.
Oh, Cumulus Linux. I didn't want to go through different flavors, but Cumulus. I just did a project. I keep saying just. It was a couple years ago, but a switch fabric managed by Cumulus Linux controller, right? Run by Ansible playbooks, right? So, and why that's important is it's been a while. I mean, Red Hat has been selling products, but it's been a long while before enterprises, start adopting open source and taking open source seriously. And they are now, right? It's in play, right? If you kind of look at the way the market's going today, and I hate to, to say this and put this in recording, but, everything's going to be controller based, right? And it makes no sense to have, a Windows controller, right? Most of them are going to be Linux, and most of them are going to have open source, and most of them have contributors, right? So when you take that look of, and I'll tell you ACI Fabric or most of the data center fabrics out there today, or even SD-WAN today, a controller, that's where your brains are, and then Kubernetes, same way, controller, nodes, right? So the brain exists in one place, right? Centralized management of network gear, right? All the hardware ends up being just hardware. That's a big statement in this market today. That's a big statement of where networking is going. So most of your controllers are going to end up being Linux based. So when we're talking
like
about,
NSO that we just did, that
Exactly.
was running on a Unix box or on a Linux box.
yes. So try to listen and see where we're trying to guide you guys as far as what to learn and things of that nature, because it's so clear to us, but we've taken what pill is it, Rich? The red pill or the blue pill? What's the matrix pill?
Red.
We've taken the red pill. All right. We know what we're talking about. So any questions before we close this up? Thank you, Elliot. Elliot, that was awesome. I appreciate you, man. I would, because I started, I was really salivating on those shell commands. It's been a while since I had to do anything shell related. So I'd love to schedule and bring you back to go over the shell stuff, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm a little. That's what I get for doing it on the fly. I don't have to do case statements and all that often, so I couldn't do that on the fly. I have to look that one up. But Shell is its own programming language, and then we can get into awk and all kinds of other things. But that's my go-to. Some people will use Excel and stuff like that. If I've got things where I've got to mash a bunch of data around and stuff like that, I'm taking that file to some kind of Unix box and I'm using awk, sed, shell.
All right, look, I'm gonna cut you off because Elliot is a bigger nerd than me, and you guys heard it here. All right, because awk and sed, I've learned awk and sed about 20 times in my life. I have actually only needed it maybe twice, but it's a very powerful when it comes to I guess file manipulation, replacements, file editing, things of that nature. Again, it's one of those things that you're happy when you learned it, and then you're mad because you go 10 years and you don't have one use case for it. That's all can said. All right. Anybody else have anything before I end this? Ioannis, thank you for joining again. We got to talk this week.
Sure.
Everybody else, enjoy your Saturday. Thank you. Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks, Elliot.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Elliot. Thank you.
Guys.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Do you understand that now?